Chapter 31: The Americas in the Age of Independence. In this chapter, we will talk about the War of 1812, the Compromise of 1850, the westward expansion, U.S. immigration, the independence of America, and railroads. The War of 1812. The War of 1812 was between the United States and Great Britain. The war ended with the Treaty of Ghent. Britain forces won. Essentially, the war was caused by British restrictions on U.S. trade and America's desire to expand its territory. After the war, peaceful relations developed between the U.S. and Great Britain. America was also confirmed as independent, and nationalism grows in the country. The Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 was a series of measures proposed by U.S. Senator Henry Clay and passed by the U.S. Congress to settle several issues connected to slavery and avert the threat of dissolution of the Union. This goes hand in hand with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, that was also a series of political compacts attempted to maintain a balance between slave and free states, as the Republic admitted new states carved out of Western territories. Once again, the causes of this compromise were that the North and South had to turn over slavery. Also, tensions developed over slavery in new territories and states, and South threatens to withdraw from the Union. After the compromise, California is admitted as a free state, residents of new territories are allowed to vote on slavery, Texas gives up claim on New Mexico, the fugitive slave law is enacted. Also, the compromise provides temporary relief from threats of secession, and the slave trade is abolished in the District of Columbia.
Westward expansion. Starting in the early 1800s, the United States began expanding its territory westward. There were many reasons for expansion, but one of the most important was the belief of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was the idea that Americans had a God-given right to expand the United States to occupy all of North America from coast to coast. One of the most substantial expansions the United States gained came from the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States at the time. The Louisiana Purchase included the acquisition of territories spanning from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, which was roughly 828,000 square miles of land. The expansion west pushed into the Native Americans' territory, and when Americans noticed this, they created the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forced all Native Americans within U.S. territory into Indian Territory, which was in Oklahoma. Their migration there, called the Trail of Tears, was very brutal, some tribes traveling upwards of 800 miles by foot, often dying of diseases or starvation along the way. Another great expansion came after the Mexican-American War of 1846. War broke out after America annexed Texas from Mexico, and Mexico didn't want America taking their land from them. The war lasted until 1848, when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, and Mexico ceded Texas north of the Rio Grande, California, and New Mexico to the U.S. U.S. immigration. In the 1800s, the U.S. gained a large amount of immigrants coming from Europe and Asia. The main cause for the surge of migrants was growing economic opportunities in the United States, Canada, and Latin America. In the United States, the gold rush of 1849 drew a huge crowd of migrants into mainly Northern California and San Francisco. Becoming a prospector or miner during the gold rush was an easy and quick way to become wealthy, and people from all over the world took advantage of this opportunity. Another large group of people migrated to the U.S. to work in growing industrial businesses and factories. In the 1850s, 2.3 million Europeans came to the U.S. to work in factories, and a large number of migrants from China came to California in the 1840s to work in the gold rush, railroads, or plantations. Plantation work was a huge pull factor to the Americas, mainly Latin America. In the 1880s and 90s, 4 million Italians migrated to Argentina and Brazil to work for coffee growers. Around 15,000 Chinese migrants worked on Cuban sugarcane farms in the 19th century, and lots of other migrants worked on creating fertilizer, building railroads, and working on other plantations. Thousands of Asians migrated to Hawaii to tend for sugarcane, and many created their own island plantations as well in the 1850s and 60s.
Hi, my name is Paula Mendoza, and I will talk to you about the independence of America. In June of 1776, a year after the war against England began, the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia to discuss America's independence. America's independence was approved in July 2 of 1776. I will give you reasons as to why the independence of America happened. The first reason was that the British provided a lot of support to the colonies during the French and Indian War. Because of the support that King George III thought was so significant, he decided that right after the war was over, he began to tax the colonies for imported goods. It started with the Sugar Act in 1764. The second reason was that the 7 Years' War was the French and Indian War that began in 1754 and ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. This war gave a lot of territorial gain from North America to Great Britain, but the war doubled Britain's national debt. They chose to pay it off by giving new taxes on top of the ones that King George III already gave. They had to its colonies, and the resistance to those taxes from the colonies eventually led to the American Revolution. The third reason was the Boston Massacre. It was that a patriot mob attacked a British loyalist who fired a gun at them, but eventually killed the boy. Because of these brawls, which are just basically fights, between colonists and British soldiers, it broke out, and there was a lot of blood spilled and lots of people killed. Therefore, it's called the Boston Massacre. Colonists, even before this, were already suspicious of how the British ruled and about the unfair taxation, so this massacre gave them even more intention to fight for independence and finally be free from them. So, how did the independence of America actually happen? The colonies chose delegates to attend the Continental Congress that was the body of the Union during the Revolution. Thomas Jefferson was actually the one who wrote the first draft for the Declaration of Independence. When he was done writing, he showed his draft to the Congress, who ended up changing some of it and taking away things like the part where King George III was blamed for the slave trade. On July 2, 1776, the Congress voted to declare independence, and they made 200 copies and they sent them out. So now let's talk about railroads. Railroads helped the process of empire building by allowing different regions of the world to interact with each other, provided reliable transportation, and they allowed the poor people to work. The railroad to the United States and Canada actually created standard time zones on November 18, 1883, so they could all have the same time and they wouldn't get confused. That would cause accidents on the roads. Railroads gave many jobs and new opportunities. It allowed for the markets in the West Coast and Asia to the East to bring products from all over the place. Because of this, it allowed for the production to boom and transported goods and raw materials. Because there was a lot of railroads, they needed a lot of workers, so they started to bring people that worked in factories to work in the railroads. Because the people that worked in the factories were leaving, a lot of the cities were declining.
Chapter 40: A World Without Borders. In this chapter, we will talk about cultural interactions, economic globalization, economic growth in Asia, global problems, AIDS, and women's rights. Cultural interactions. The demise of European colonial empires, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the end of the Cold War brought down the most obvious political barriers of the post-World War II world. At the turn of the 20th century, local traditions commonly derived from gender, social class, or religious affiliation still determine the cultural identity of the vast majority of people. The Global Barbie. In October 1996, a story describing the creation of the Sarah doll, who would go against American cultural influences, was published, which promoted the chaste dress and pure values expected from Islamic girls and women. Majid Jadari, the designer of the dolls, viewed Barbie as a metaphor for unwanted cultural dominance. Iranian officials created the traditional Sarah doll to oppose Barbie's influence, suggesting how strongly some societies strive to counteract foreign cultural influence. Yule's cultural system modified its produce to conform the indigenous expectations. The girl that makes the Barbies adjusted the Barbie to Japanese cultural sensibilities. They named this Barbie Lika and had doe eyes, was brunette, and was a younger doll. The Barbie challenged Japanese actions of a less emancipated femininity, consumption, and cultural interactions. In the beginning of the 18th century, industrialization and rise in the per capita income gave birth to a type of society in which the consumption of goods and services satisfied wants and desires rather than need and necessity. Consumption, in other words, has become a means of self-expression as well as a source of personal identity and social differentiation. The term Americanization suggests that the customer culture that developed in the United States during the mid-20th century has exported throughout the world through advertising, most of the time spreading food and beverage products. The Age of Access. Throughout history, technological advances such as shipbuilding provided the means to dissolve boundaries between locals and people and thus allowed cultural transmissions to take place. Contemporary observers have labeled our era the Age of Access. Communication by radio, television, fax machine, and networked computers have spawned a global village that has swept away the social, economic, and political isolation of the past. Mass media are a vehicle for cultural imperialism because most electronic media carry emanate from advanced capitalist societies. English has almost become the universal language, enjoying acceptance in the scientific, diplomatic, and commercial circles. Some societies have managed to adapt European and US technology to meet their needs while opposing cultural interference. Television, for example, has been used to promote state building around the world. The revolution in electronic communications have been virtually controlled on other societies, including Vietnam and Iraq, where authorities limit access to foreign services on the internet. Economic globalization. The global economy came into public view after the spectacular of communism in 1990. Technology developments in communications, semiconductors, fiber optic cables, and satellites have virtually eliminated geographic distances. Free trade. International trade proved to be a key driving force behind economic globalization. Free trade implemented that freedom from state-imposed limits and constraints on trade across borders. GATT and WTO. U.S. politicians and businesses leaders push for the elimination of restrictive trading practices that stood in the way of free trade. General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, also known as GATT, had representatives of 23 non-communist nations in 1947. They held a series of negotiations with the intent of removing or loosening barriers to free trade. In 1994, now totaling 123, signed an agreement to establish the World Trade Organization, also known as WTO, which took over GATT activities in 1995. World trade between 1948 and 1966 grew by 6.6% annually and by 8.2% annually between 1966 and 1977. Trade slowed in the 1980s, but in 1990, world trade exceeded 6 trillion US dollars. Now, global corporations. Global corporations have increasingly replaced the more traditional international or multinational forms of corporate enterprises. International companies desire to extend business activities across borders. Now they evolved into multinational. They want exportation, importation, and the extraction of raw materials. Corporate landscapes have resulted in the birth of some 50,000 global corporations. Global corporation relies on small headquarters staff while dispersing all over corporate functions across the globe in search of the lowest possible operating cost. Many multinational corporations such as General Motors, Siemens and AG, and Nestle have transformed themselves into global enterprises, both benefiting from and contributing to the ongoing process of globalization. Combination of collective bargaining agreements, tax laws, and environmental regulations were used by companies to contribute to the welfare of their communities. Competing with companies around the world, the global corporation has moved jobs from high-wage facilities to foreign locations where wages are low, environmental are weak or non-existent. The efforts of governments to introduce businesses into keeping their corporations at home by reducing the corporate tax burden have been only partially successful.
Economic growth in Asia. Globalization caused worldwide economic integration to speed up, which benefited the economic development in East and Southeast Asia. After 1945, Japan's economy had begun recovery after Japan's defeat in World War II, and it was already back to pre-war productivity by 1949. The US helped Japan's economy to grow. They had no restrictions on imports from Japan, and they gave Japan $2 million to recover from the war. Japan began manufacturing high-priced consumer goods like TV sets and cars for cheap labor, and they imported these products mostly to the US. By the 1980s, they were set to almost exceed the United States economy size. Inspired by Japan's success, the Four Little Tigers, which are Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, rapidly grew their economies in a similar fashion. The Tigers began industrializing and using imported materials to manufacture cheaper versions of Japan's products, and by the 1990s, they were serious competition with Japan's goods. In China, the creation of market economy occurred in 1992, and they began becoming major exporters and manufacturers with extremely cheap labor costs. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001 and were close to becoming an economic superpower. All the economic growth in Asia had caused some problems to occur. In 1997, previously poor countries who became investors in these Asian countries lost their confidence in their economies and withdrew support. The crisis began in Thailand, and its national currency lost 75% of its value. The same thing occurred throughout the rest of East and Southeast Asia. Global problems. The past 30 to 40 years have brought a significant amount of global problems, including terrorism, disease, poverty, and overpopulation and pollution. First of all, terrorism, by definition, is the use of violence to magnify power and receive demands. Terror tactics and headline-grabbing acts of violence towards innocent people have become especially prominent in the late 90s and early 2000s. The attacks on the Twin Towers in the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, for example, was a very tragic terrorist attack that pretty much everyone knows about. This attack led to the United States declaring war on Osama bin Laden, who was responsible for the attack, as well as global terrorism itself. Another global problem is disease. Prominent examples are Ebola and AIDS. However, AIDS was the most widespread, and it will be talked about on the next slide. Poverty was and still is a huge problem worldwide. Global prices rising and a lack of high-paying jobs leave millions of people with less money than they need to survive, and there is an ever-growing gap between rich and poor people. Another reason poverty is such a problem is because of overpopulation. The world's population has rapidly grown over the years, so much so that it has become a problem. If it continues to grow, global resources won't be able to support everyone, and we will eventually run out. Some places like China made policies to limit population growth. For example, the one-child policy, where families could only have one child, or increased push to using birth control. Growing population causes more pollution worldwide. Overuse of natural resources causes air and water pollution, as well as adds to the factors causing global warming. The effects of global warming could be detrimental and flood a lot of the world, which is why it's such a huge problem.
So AIDS, it's a life-threatening condition caused by HIV. It damages the immune system and it interferes with the body's ability to fight infections and diseases. So how was AIDS spread? AIDS was spread by many ways. Sexual contact with an infected person, contact with contaminated blood, from mother to child during pregnancy and after birth while breastfeeding. So where was AIDS first seen? Medical experts found AIDS for the first time in 1981 among homosexual men and drug users in New York and San Francisco. Epidemic appeared among heterosexual men, women, and children in sub-Saharan Africa, and AIDS very quickly developed into a worldwide pandemic, causing millions of deaths among children, women, men, everything. Sub-Saharan was actually struck the hardest, with 24.5 million people that had AIDS. AIDS have killed thousands of people, and in the case of children, it actually left them orphans. There were approximately 10 million kids that were orphans. Women's right. So women's right is in the 1960s and 70s, women wanted equal rights and greater personal freedom. Since men went away to serve in the military and demands for the war material was increasing, manufacturing jobs opened up to women and increased their earning power. But women employment only lasted until there was a war to fight. In 1950, the communist leaders passed a marriage law that declared a new democratic marriage system, which is based on free choice of partners, on a monogamy, on equal rights for both sexes, and on protection of the lawful interests of women and children. Women demonstrated their ability in so many ways. They became political figures, they joined organizations, or participated in activities designed to further the cause of women's rights.